In the dense silence of the early morning, the rain streamed down the hospital windows. On a metal gurney, an injured police officer was being taken to the infirmary, surrounded by equipment. Outside, a police dog remained seated, refusing to leave the door. Doctors adjusted monitors, recording variations that changed for no apparent reason. In the hallway, nurses exchanged glances upon noticing the motionless animal, listening to every sound. An unknown employee approached the medical records, but was blocked by the dog. In the next room, cameras showed a hand tampering with the cables of the machines, and for an instant, time inside the infirmary simply stopped. Do you love animal stories? Then subscribe now and don't miss any. Thanks for joining us. Now, back to our story. The morning shift at Mountain View Correctional Facility began like any other, with the familiar symphony of heavy doors slamming shut and keys jangling against steel. Jake Morrison adjusted his uniform collar as he walked down the main corridor, his boots echoing against the polished concrete floor. 23 years he had worked these halls, and still the routine felt as rigid as the day he started. But there was one thing that had changed in recent months, something that defied all explanation and had become the talk of every guard station. Rex, a German shepherd trained for detection and crowd control, had taken up permanent residence. In front of cell block D7, the massive dog sat motionless, his dark eyes fixed on a particular cell door that hadn't been opened in over a decade. His black and tan coat gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and his ears remained perpetually alert, as if waiting for a sound that never came. "Still there, isn't he?" Bobby Williams approached Jake, shaking his graying head. Bobby had been at Mountain View even longer than Jake, and his weathered face showed every year of dealing with the most dangerous criminals in the state of Colorado. 37 days straight now. I've been counting. Jake nodded, watching Rex's unwavering posture. The dog hadn't moved more than a few feet from that spot since the beginning of autumn. Food and water had to be brought to him, and even then, he would only eat while keeping one eye on the cell door. Dr. Peterson from the K9 unit was here yesterday, ran every test imaginable. Rex is in perfect health, physically and mentally. There's just no explanation for this behavior. "Have you talked to Warden Collins about it?" Bobby asked, lowering his voice as they approached the dog. Rex acknowledged their presence with a slight turn of his massive head, but his gaze quickly returned to the cell. The door was solid steel, painted institutional green decades ago, now showing patches of rust around the edges. A small window, no bigger than a dinner plate, sat at eye level, covered with thick glass that had turned opaque with age and neglect. "The warden's been getting pressure from the state inspectors," Jake replied, running a hand through his graying hair. "They want answers too. A police dog refusing orders, abandoning his duties to guard an empty cell. It doesn't look good on reports." Sarah Collins had indeed been fielding questions about Rex for weeks. As the first female warden in Mountain View's 40-year history, she couldn't afford any irregularities that might question her authority or competence. The prison housed some of Colorado's most challenging cases, and maintaining order was her top priority. Marcus Thompson, the newest addition to the guard staff, jogged up to join them. At 25, he still carried the enthusiasm of someone who believed he could make a difference in the correctional system. His short blonde hair and clean-shaven face made him look even younger than his years. "Morning, gentlemen," Marcus said, slightly out of breath. "I just came from the control room. They've been watching the security feeds all night. Rex hasn't moved, not once. He didn't even flinch when that fight broke out in cell block C." This last detail sent a chill down Jake's spine. Rex had been trained to respond immediately to any signs of disturbance or violence. For him to ignore a fight was completely against his nature and training. The dog lived to work, to serve and protect, yet here he was, completely fixated on an empty cell that had been sealed since 2009. "What do we know about that cell anyway?" Marcus asked, his curiosity getting the better of him. Bobby shifted uncomfortably. "Cell 47D has been out of commission since the renovation project. They were going to update the electrical systems in that whole wing, but budget cuts stopped the project halfway through. Been abandoned ever since." "But what about before the renovation?" Marcus pressed. "Who was the last occupant?" Jake and Bobby exchanged glances. The truth was, none of them had thought to check the historical records. The administrative focus had always been on active cells and current inmates. The abandoned wing was simply that. Abandoned, forgotten, irrelevant to daily operations. "I could pull the files," Jake offered. "Might take some digging, though. The older records aren't digitized yet." Rex suddenly stood up, his ears perking forward with intense alertness. The three men froze, watching as the dog took 2 steps closer to the cell door. His hackles didn't rise, but his entire body language shifted to high alert. For nearly 30 seconds, he remained perfectly still, as if listening to something they couldn't hear. Then, just as suddenly, he returned to his sitting position, resuming his patient vigil. "Did you hear anything?" Marcus whispered. Both older guards shook their heads. The corridor was silent, except for the distant hum of ventilation systems and the occasional echo from other parts of the facility. Elena Rodriguez, the facility's head psychologist, appeared around the corner carrying a steaming cup of coffee. Her dark hair was pulled back in a professional bun, and her kind eyes held the wisdom of someone who had spent years understanding the human mind in its most complex states. "Good morning, gentlemen," she said warmly, then looked down at Rex. "And good morning to you too, faithful guardian. Dr. Rodriguez?" Jake nodded respectfully. "Any insights into our 4-legged mystery?" Elena sipped her coffee thoughtfully. "I've been observing Rex's behavior patterns for 2 weeks now. What's fascinating is that his fixation isn't random. There's a purpose to it, a method. He's not exhibiting signs of obsessive-compulsive behavior or psychological trauma. If anything, he appears to be performing what he perceives as his duty." "But what duty?" Bobby asked, frustration creeping into his voice. "That cell has been empty for over a decade." "Has it, though?" Eleanor asked quietly, her question hanging in the air like morning fog. The implications of her words settled over them slowly. Marcus was the first to voice what they were all thinking. "You mean someone might have been kept there off the books?" Elena held up her hand diplomatically. "I'm not suggesting anything improper, but Rex is a detection dog. He's trained to find things that are hidden. What if he's detecting something we haven't considered?" Jake felt a knot forming in his stomach. In his 23 years at Mountain View, he had seen 3 different administrations, witnessed policy changes, staff rotations, and countless procedural updates. But he had always trusted that the system, however flawed, operated within legal boundaries. "I'll pull those records today," he said firmly. "Whatever's in that cell's history, we need to know." Rex's ears twitched again, and this time all 4 humans heard it, a faint sound, like something settling or shifting behind the steel door. It was so subtle it could have been the building, settling, pipes expanding, or ventilation moving through unused spaces. But Rex's reaction suggested otherwise. The dog stood again, this time moving to place his nose directly against the small gap at the bottom of the door. He inhaled deeply, his entire body focused on whatever scent he was processing. "I'm calling the warden," Marcus said, reaching for his radio. "She needs to see this." "Wait," Elena said softly. "Let me try something first." She approached Rex slowly, speaking in gentle, measured tones. "Rex, what is it, boy? What do you smell? What do you know that we don't? The German shepherd looked up at her, and for a moment, Jake could have sworn he saw something almost human in the dog's eyes, a kind of desperate urgency, as if he was trying to communicate something vitally important, but lacked the means to do so. Elena knelt down beside Rex, placing a gentle hand on his head. "You're trying to tell us something, aren't you? Something about this place, about what happened here." As if responding to her understanding, Rex moved to the cell door and placed both front paws against it, stretching up toward the small window. He wasn't scratching or trying to damage anything. It was more like he was pointing, directing their attention to something specific. "The window," Marcus breathed. "He wants us to look through the window." Jake stepped forward, producing a small flashlight from his belt. The glass was cloudy and scratched, but by pressing his face close and shining the light at the right angle, he could make out the interior of the cell. What he saw made his blood run cold. The cell wasn't empty. It was filled with shadows that seemed to move independently of his flashlight beam, and along the far wall he could make out what looked like scratches or markings carved deep into the concrete. But most unsettling of all was the immediate sense that he was looking at a place where something terrible had been hidden away, forgotten by design rather than accident. He stepped back from the window, his face pale. "We need that key, and we need it now." The master keys to cell block D felt heavier than usual in Jake's hands as he approached the rusted lock of cell 47D. Word had spread quickly through the facility, and now a small crowd had gathered in the corridor. Warden Sarah Collins stood beside Elena Rodriguez, both women wearing expressions of professional concern mixed with undeniable curiosity. "I want everyone to understand," Sarah addressed the assembled group. "This is a routine inspection of an abandoned facility. We follow protocol, we document everything, and we maintain the security and safety standards this institution is known for." Rex had not moved from his position during the 20 minutes it took to assemble the proper personnel and equipment. If anything, his vigil had intensified. The German shepherd's breathing had become more rapid, and a low, almost inaudible whine emanated from deep in his chest. Marcus had brought additional lighting equipment, while Bobby carried a digital camera to document whatever they might find. The maintenance supervisor, Tom Bradley, arrived with his toolkit, ready to address any structural issues they might encounter. "Before we open this door," Elena said thoughtfully, "I want everyone to observe Rex's behavior. Notice how his anxiety level has increased since we decided to investigate. This isn't random animal behavior. He's responding to our intent as much as to whatever he senses inside that cell." Jake inserted the key into the lock, surprised by how smoothly it turned despite years of apparent disuse. The mechanism clicked open with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire corridor. Rex immediately stood and backed away several steps, his intelligent eyes fixed on the door, but his body language suggesting he wanted distance from whatever was about to be revealed. "Interesting," Elena murmured. "He wanted us to open it, but now he's afraid of what we'll find." The door swung open with a prolonged creak that spoke of neglected hinges and shifting metal. Jake shone his flashlight into the darkness, and what they saw took everyone by surprise. The cell was indeed occupied, not by a person, but by years of accumulated evidence that someone had been using this space far more recently than the official abandonment date suggested. Fresh scratches marked the walls in deliberate patterns, almost like a primitive form of communication or record-keeping. The concrete floor showed wear patterns that couldn't have survived a decade of disuse. "This cell has been accessed regularly," Tom Bradley said, his maintenance expertise immediately apparent. "Look at the hinges. They're rusted on the outside, But the pivot points show recent use. Someone has been oiling these mechanisms. Sarah Collins felt her stomach drop. As warden, she was responsible for every aspect of this facility's operations. If someone had been using abandoned cells without authorization, it represented a massive security breach and potential liability for the state. "I need a complete inventory of everything in this cell," she ordered, her voice maintaining professional, calm despite her growing concern. "And I want the security footage from every camera in this block reviewed for the past 6 months. Marcus stepped carefully into the cell, his camera flash illuminating corners that hadn't seen official light in years. What he found defied all reasonable explanation. Personal items were scattered throughout the small space: a worn leather boot, several pieces of clothing, a small notebook with pages covered in cramped handwriting, and most puzzling of all, a collection of pills and medical supplies. "These medications," Elena said, examining the bottles Marcus had carefully photographed before moving them. "Some of these prescriptions are recent. This one is dated last month." Bobby Williams ran his hand along the wall scratches, feeling the depth and texture. "These aren't random marks. Someone was keeping track of time or days or events. Look here. There's a pattern, almost like a calendar." Jake studied the scratches more closely. 63 marks in this section, then a different symbol, then 63 more. This person was counting something systematically. The notebook proved to be the most unsettling discovery. The handwriting was shaky but legible, filled with entries that read like a combination of journal and desperate plea for help. The pages spoke of loneliness, confusion, and repeated references to "they don't know I'm here" and "waiting for someone to find me." "This handwriting," Sarah said, examining the notebook over Eleanor's shoulder, "it doesn't match any current inmate files I'm familiar with. The style is educated, articulate. This person had formal schooling." Rex had crept closer to the open door, but refused to enter the cell. Instead, he positioned himself where he could observe everything while maintaining his distance. His behavior suggested he was both protective and wary, as if guarding against something while simultaneously being afraid of it. "There's something else," Marcus called from the back corner of the cell. "There's a loose stone here, and it looks like it's been moved recently." Tom Bradley joined him with a crowbar, carefully prying at the indicated stone. Behind it, they discovered a small cavity that had been deliberately created. Inside were more personal items, photographs, letters, and what appeared to be official documents that had been carefully preserved. The photographs showed an elderly man with kind eyes and gentle features, alone in some shots, with various people in others. The documents were even more puzzling: medical records, transfer authorizations, and correspondence that seemed to reference treatments and care plans for someone with dementia or other cognitive impairments. "Eleanor Hartman," Elena read from one of the documents. "Age 73, diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's disease, transferred from Millfield Nursing Home to Specialized Care Facility, October 2022. The date sent a chill through everyone present. October 2022 was barely 6 months ago, well, after Cell Block D had been officially abandoned. "That's impossible," Sarah said, her voice strained. "We don't house elderly patients with medical conditions. This facility isn't equipped for that kind of care, and we certainly don't accept transfers from nursing homes." Bobby had been quietly examining the documents. "Look at the authorization. Signatures on these transfer papers. They're not from our current administration. Some of these names I recognize from years ago. Staff who haven't worked here in over 5 years." The implications were staggering. Either someone had been forging documents using outdated administrative information, or there had been an unauthorized operation running within the facility using obsolete protocols and personnel. "I want every record from 2022 pulled and cross-referenced," Sarah ordered, her warden training taking over despite her growing unease. "Every visitor log, every delivery record, every maintenance report. If someone was operating outside our system, there will be traces." Elena was studying the journal entries more carefully. These writings, they describe someone who was confused about where they were, but they also show periods of lucidity. This person knew they weren't supposed to be here, but they also reference staff members bringing food and medicine. "What kind of staff members?" Jake asked. "Someone named Jenny, who brings soup, and the quiet man who checks my medicine. They're described with affection, like this person trusted them completely." Marcus had been photographing everything systematically when he noticed something that made him freeze. In one of the photographs they'd found, the elderly woman was sitting in what was unmistakably the visiting room of Mountain View Correctional Facility. The institutional furniture and wall color were distinctive and recognizable. "She was definitely here," he said quietly, showing the photograph to the others. "This was taken in our visiting room, probably within the last year, based on the condition of the furniture." Rex suddenly began pacing in tight circles, his agitation increasing dramatically. The dog started to whine more audibly, then let out a series of sharp barks that echoed through the empty cell block. "What's wrong with him?" Sarah asked, but Elena was already moving toward the dog. "Rex, what is it? What do you hear?" The German shepherd stopped pacing and stood rigid, every muscle in his body tense with attention. His ears were pricked forward, focused on something beyond human perception. Then they all heard it, the distant sound of footsteps approaching down the corridor, slow and deliberate. But what made the sound unsettling was that it was coming from the direction of the abandoned wing, an area that had been officially sealed and declared off-limits for safety reasons. "Nobody is supposed to be in that section," Tom Bradley said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I personally secured those access points 2 years ago." The footsteps were getting closer, accompanied now by what sounded like someone dragging or pulling something heavy. Sarah reached for her radio, but Jake stopped her with a gentle hand on her wrist. "Wait," he whispered. "Let's see who or what this is before we call for backup." Rex had positioned himself between the group and the approaching sounds, his body, language clearly protective. Whatever was coming, the dog was prepared to defend the humans behind him, even though his earlier behavior had suggested fear. The sounds stopped just around the corner, perhaps 50 feet from where they stood. In the sudden silence that followed, they could hear their own heartbeats and the quiet hum of the facility's ventilation system. Then, clear as day, came the sound of a woman's voice, weak but distinctly audible, calling out a single word that sent chills down every spine in that corridor. "Help!" The voice calling for help seemed to hang in the air like a ghostly whisper, freezing everyone in place. Sarah Collins felt her professional composure crack as the implications of what they were hearing settled over her like a cold blanket. If someone was actually in the abandoned wing, every protocol she had established as warden was being violated. Jake Morrison took point, his years of experience taking over as he gestured for the others to stay back. Rex immediately fell into step beside him, the German shepherd's training overriding his earlier anxiety. Together, they moved cautiously toward the corner where the sound had originated. What they found around the bend was not what anyone had expected. The corridor stretched empty before them, but the security door that should have been locked and sealed stood slightly ajar. Through the gap, they could see into what had once been the facility's medical wing before the renovation budget. Cuts forced its closure. "That door has been welded shut for 18 months, Tom Bradley whispered, his face pale with confusion. "I supervised the work myself. No one should have been able to open it." But the evidence was undeniable. Not only was the door open, but the metal around the frame showed recent tool marks where someone had carefully cut through the welds. The work was professional, precise, and completely unauthorized. Elena Rodriguez moved closer to examine the modified door. This wasn't forced open. Someone with proper equipment and knowledge did this. They took their time and made sure it would be difficult to detect unless you looked closely. Marcus raised his camera to document the breach, but Sarah stopped him with a sharp gesture. Not yet. We don't know what we're dealing with, and I won't have unauthorized photographs circulating until I understand the full situation. Rex was becoming increasingly agitated again, whining softly and pawing at the ground. His behavior suggested he wanted to go through the door, but something was holding him back. Elena knelt beside him, speaking in soothing tones. "What do you know, Rex? What are you trying to tell us?" As if responding to her question, another sound drifted through the open door, the soft shuffle of slippered feet against linoleum. Someone was definitely moving around in the abandoned medical wing, and from the hesitant, unsteady nature of the movement, it sounded like an elderly person. Jake made a decision that would haunt him for years to come. Against all protocols and his better judgment, he pushed open the security door and stepped into the sealed wing. The air inside was stale, but not unbreathable, suggesting the ventilation system had been partially restored. Emergency lighting cast eerie shadows along walls that had been stripped of medical equipment, but still retained the antiseptic smell of a healthcare facility. "Hello?" Jake called softly. "This is Officer Morrison with Mountain View Correctional. If someone is here, please identify yourself." The shuffling sound stopped immediately, replaced by what sounded like someone trying to hide or find shelter. Rex brushed past Jake's legs and began moving down the corridor with purpose, no longer showing the fear he had displayed earlier. It was as if crossing this threshold had activated some deeply ingrained protective instinct. Sarah followed reluctantly, knowing she should call for backup, but unable to abandon her responsibility to ensure the safety of anyone who might be in distress. The abandoned medical wing felt like stepping back in time. Empty rooms with outdated equipment, faded motivational posters still clinging to walls, and the persistent atmosphere of a place where important work had once been done. They found her in what had been the recovery room. Eleanor Hartman sat in a wheelchair beside a window that looked out over the prison yard, her silver hair neatly combed and her clothes clean but clearly worn. She appeared to be in her 70s, exactly as described in the documents they had found, but her presence here was impossible to explain through any legitimate channels. "Eleanor," Elena spoke gently, approaching with the caution of someone trained to work with vulnerable populations. "My name is Dr. Rodriguez. Are you hurt? Do you need medical attention?" The elderly woman looked up with eyes that showed the confusion characteristic of dementia, but also a flicker of relief at seeing friendly faces. "I've been waiting," she said in a voice that was surprisingly strong despite her apparent frailty. "Jenny said someone would come to take me home, but that was it yesterday? Time moves strangely here." Jake felt his world tilt off its axis. This woman was clearly not a prisoner, had never been a prisoner, and had no business being in a maximum security facility, yet here she was, apparently being cared for by someone who had unlimited access to sealed areas of the prison. "Eleanor," Sarah said, kneeling beside the wheelchair, "can you tell us how you came to be here? Do you remember arriving at this place?" The woman's expression grew more confused, and she began twisting her hands in her lap, a behavior Elena recognized as anxiety manifestation in dementia patients. The nice man said I needed special medicine they could only give me here. But I don't think this is a hospital. It's too loud at night, and sometimes I hear people shouting. Rex had positioned himself directly beside Eleanor's wheelchair, and the woman reached down to pet his head with obvious familiarity. "Hello, Rex. Have you been taking care of everyone while I was resting?" The casual way she greeted the dog sent chills through the assembled group. This wasn't their first meeting. Eleanor had been here long enough to form a relationship with Rex, long enough for the dog to become attached to her and protective of her well-being. Elena continued patiently, "Can you tell us about Jenny or the nice man who brought you here? What do they look like?" "Jenny is young and kind. She brings me soup and makes sure I take my pills. She said not to worry about being here, that it was temporary while they found me a proper place. And Dr. Stevens, he checks on me every few days. He said my condition requires special monitoring." Marcus had been taking notes discreetly, and now he looked up with alarm. "Dr. Stevens retired from the State Medical Board 3 years ago. He's been living in Florida since 2020. The web of impossibilities was growing thicker with every revelation. Someone had been using the names and authority of former staff members to maintain the illusion of legitimate care for Eleanor. But who had the access, knowledge, and resources to pull off such an elaborate deception? Tom Bradley had been examining the room more closely and discovered something that explained how Eleanor's presence had gone undetected. They've tapped into the main power grid, but they've hidden the connection behind false panels. This entire wing has been receiving electricity, but it's not showing up on any of our monitoring systems. Whoever did this has extensive knowledge of the facility's infrastructure." The implications were staggering. Someone within the prison system, someone with administrative access, technical knowledge, and the ability to forge documents had been using abandoned facilities to house Eleanor Hartman. But why? And what did they gain from keeping an elderly dementia patient in a maximum security prison? Eleanor began to speak again, her voice taking on the distant quality of someone whose memory was drifting between different time periods. "My son visits sometimes. He says he's working on getting me into a proper facility, but there are waiting lists. He looks so sad when he sees me here. I tell him it's not so bad. Jenny takes good care of me and Rex keeps me company." Sarah felt her blood run cold. "Eleanor, when was the last time you saw your son?" "Yesterday? Last week?" "Time moves strangely here," Eleanor repeated, her confusion evident. "But he always brings me chocolate. He knows I love chocolate." Bobby. Williams had been unusually quiet during the conversation, but now he stepped forward with an expression of dawning horror. "The visitor logs. I need to check the visitor logs. If her son has been coming here regularly, there should be records." But even as he said it, Bobby realized the flaw in that logic. If this entire operation was unauthorized and hidden, the visits wouldn't appear in official records. Someone would have to arrange for Eleanor's son to enter and exit the facility without going through normal security procedures. Rex suddenly stood up and moved to the window, pressing his nose against the glass and whining softly. Following his gaze, they could see a small group of inmates in the exercise yard below, but nothing seemed unusual about the scene. "What is it, Rex?" Elena asked. "What do you see?" The German shepherd began pacing between Eleanor and the window, his behavior becoming more agitated by the minute. It was as if he sensed something approaching, some change in the routine that had kept Eleanor hidden and safe. Eleanor reached out and touched Rex's head gently. "It's okay, boy. You've done such a good job watching over me. But I think it's time for them to know the truth." The way she said it, with a sudden clarity that cut through her confusion, suggested that Eleanor Hartman knew more about her situation than her dementia symptoms had indicated. There were moments, brief but unmistakable when the fog cleared and she understood exactly what was happening to her. "Eleanor," Elena said urgently, sensing the importance of this lucid moment. "What truth? What is it that Rex has been trying to protect?" The elderly woman looked around at all the concerned faces surrounding her, and for the first time since they had found her, she smiled. It was a sad smile, filled with resignation and gratitude. Rex knew that if he stayed by that cell, if he kept vigil long enough, eventually someone would investigate. Someone would find me. He's been trying to save me, just like he saved my son all those years ago. The revelation hit Sarah Collins like a physical blow. Eleanor's son had been at Mountain View Correctional before, but as what? An inmate, a staff member. And how did that connection lead to this elaborate hidden arrangement? Before anyone could ask the obvious follow-up questions, Rex's ears perked up and he moved protectively in front of Eleanor's wheelchair. Footsteps were approaching down the corridor, not the hesitant shuffle of an elderly person, but the confident stride of someone who belonged here and knew exactly where they were going. Someone was coming, and based on Rex's defensive posture, it might not be a reunion Eleanor was hoping for. The footsteps in the corridor belonged to Jennifer "Jenny" Patterson, a young woman in scrubs who froze when she saw the group gathered around Eleanor. Her face went through a rapid series of emotions: surprise, fear, and finally resigned acceptance. In her hands, she carried a lunch tray and a small bag that clearly contained medication. "I can explain," Jenny said quietly, setting the tray on a nearby table with trembling hands. "Please don't hurt her. She's been through enough." Sarah Collins stepped forward, her warden training demanding answers, but her human instincts recognizing genuine concern in the young woman's voice. "Who are you, and what is your authorization for being in this facility?" "My name is Jennifer Patterson. I'm a registered nurse, and I've been caring for Eleanor for the past 6 months. Jenny's voice gained strength as she continued. "And, before you ask, no, I don't have official authorization, but I couldn't let her suffer in a system that had forgotten she existed." Jake Morrison studied the young nurse carefully. She appeared to be in her late 20s, with the competent bearing of someone accustomed to medical responsibility. Her scrubs were clean and professional, and the way she moved suggested she was completely familiar with this environment. "How did you gain access to sealed areas of this facility?" Sarah demanded. "Do you understand the security violations you've committed?" Jenny glanced at Eleanor, who was watching the conversation with the detached interest of someone whose memory made it difficult to follow complex discussions. Rex remained protectively close to the elderly woman, but his earlier agitation had calmed somewhat with Jenny's arrival. "I had help," Jenny admitted. "Someone who knew this place inside and out. Someone who couldn't bear to see Eleanor trapped in a system that was failing her." Elena Rodriguez moved closer to Jenny, her psychological training picking up on subtle cues in the nurse's body language. "You mentioned Eleanor's son earlier. Where does he fit into this?" The question seemed to hit Jenny like a physical blow. She closed her eyes briefly, gathering courage for what she was about to reveal. "David Hartman was my patient 5 years ago. He was serving time here at Mountain View for financial fraud, white-collar crime, victimless except for his own family's reputation. He was a good man who made poor choices under pressure." Marcus Thompson had been taking notes, and now he looked up with recognition. "David Hartman. I remember that name from the files. He was released 18 months ago, model prisoner, completed a master's degree in social work while incarcerated." "That's right," Jenny continued, her voice growing stronger with each revelation. "David used his time here to study, to understand systems of care and how they could fail people like his mother. After his release, he discovered that Eleanor had been placed in a substandard facility where she was being neglected, possibly abused. Sarah felt the pieces beginning to form a picture, but it was a picture that implicated her institution in ways that made her deeply uncomfortable. So you're telling me that a former inmate conspired to bring his mother into this prison illegally? It wasn't meant to be permanent, Jenny said defensively. David had been working with social services for months, trying to get Eleanor into proper memory care. But the waiting lists are years long for quality facilities she could afford, and the place where she was staying. It was horrible. She was losing weight, developing infections from poor hygiene, and her condition was deteriorating rapidly. Bobby Williams had been listening intently, and now he asked the question that was bothering everyone. How does a former inmate gain access to abandoned areas of a maximum security prison? Even with inside knowledge, the security systems would prevent unauthorized entry. Jenny's hesitation suggested this was the part of the story she had been dreading. David had help from someone still employed here, someone who believed that Eleanor deserved better than what the system was offering her. The implications hit everyone simultaneously. There was a current staff member involved in this conspiracy, someone with administrative access and detailed knowledge of facility operations, someone who could manipulate visitor logs, arrange for medical supplies, and ensure that Eleanor's presence remained undetected. Tom Bradley had been examining the modified security door more closely, and now he looked up with a grim expression. Whoever did this work knew our systems intimately. They understood which areas weren't monitored closely, how to tap into power grids without triggering alarms, and how to modify security barriers without leaving obvious traces. This is insider knowledge. Rex suddenly stood and moved to the window again, his attention focused on something in the yard below. This time, when the others followed his gaze, they saw what had captured his interest. A man in civilian clothes was walking across the exercise area, moving with purpose toward the main building. Even from a distance, his resemblance to Eleanor was unmistakable. "David," Eleanor said suddenly, her voice filled with joy and recognition. "My son is here. He comes every week to check on me." Jenny's face went pale. He wasn't supposed to come today. Something must be wrong. Sarah immediately reached for her radio, but Eleanor stopped her with a gentle hand. "Wait, let's understand the full situation before we escalate this. If David Hartman is coming here, he might have information we need." The group waited in tense silence as footsteps approached through the facility. These were different from Jenny's quiet steps, confident, urgent, and clearly familiar with the route. Within minutes, David Hartman appeared in the doorway of the recovery room. He was a man in his early 40s, well-dressed in business casual attire that spoke of professional success despite his criminal history. His eyes immediately went to his mother, and the relief and love in his expression was unmistakable. But when he saw the assembled group of prison officials, his face hardened with protective determination. "I assume you've discovered our arrangement," David said calmly, moving to kneel beside Eleanor's wheelchair. "I want you to know that everything we've done has been for her welfare, and I take full responsibility for any violations of law or policy." Jake Morrison found himself impressed despite the circumstances. David Hartman wasn't trying to run, wasn't making excuses, and wasn't abandoning the people who had helped him. Whatever his past mistakes, he was facing this situation with integrity. "Mr. Hartman," Sarah said formally, "you're aware that bringing an unauthorized person into a correctional facility is a federal offense? And that anyone who assisted you could face serious criminal charges?" "I'm fully aware," David replied steadily. "But I'm also aware that my mother was slowly dying in a facility where she was forgotten and neglected. Jenny has kept detailed medical records that document how Eleanor's condition has actually improved under proper care. Sometimes doing what's Right requires breaking rules that aren't serving the people they're supposed to protect. Elena studied the family dynamic, noting how Eleanor's confusion seemed to lessen in her son's presence. David, can you help us understand how this arrangement came to be? Who else is involved? And how long did you plan to continue? David glanced at Jenny, who nodded encouragingly. I never intended for this to be permanent. We've been working with a social worker who specializes in emergency placements for dementia patients. There's a facility in Denver that has agreed to accept Eleanor, but they needed 3 months to prepare a specialized care plan and secure funding. 3 months from when? Marcus asked. From next week, David replied. Eleanor was scheduled to be transferred to proper memory care in 10 days. This was always meant to be temporary emergency shelter while the legitimate system caught up with her needs. Bobby Williams was studying David carefully. You still haven't told us who helped you gain access to this facility. A former inmate doesn't just walk into a maximum security prison with his mother and set up housekeeping in an abandoned wing. The question hung in the air like a challenge. David looked at his mother, then at Jenny, then at Rex, who had positioned himself as if standing guard over all of them. Finally, he looked directly at Sarah Collins. The person who helped me was someone who worked here during my incarceration, someone who saw how broken the system could be and wanted to make a difference, someone who believed that showing mercy was more important than following rules blindly. Sarah felt her heart rate accelerate. The way David was looking at her, the specific phrasing of his explanation, suggested that she knew the person he was referring to. But more than that, it suggested the person was someone she trusted, someone close to her administrative circle. Rex began to pace again, his attention divided between Eleanor and the corridor beyond. His behavior suggested that more changes were coming, that the careful balance that had kept Eleanor safe and hidden was about to shift dramatically. Eleanor reached out and took her son's hand. David, I think it's time to go home now. I'm tired of being confused about where I am. The simple statement, delivered with perfect clarity, reminded everyone that at the center of this complex web of deception and good intentions was a vulnerable human being who deserved dignity, safety, and proper care. But as Rex's agitation increased and distant voices could be heard approaching through the facility, it became clear that their window for a quiet resolution was rapidly closing. The approaching voices belonged to a team of state inspectors who had arrived for their monthly review, completely unaware that their routine visit was about to uncover the most unusual situation in Mountain View's history. Sarah Collins could hear her assistant director, Patricia Walsh, attempting to redirect them away from the abandoned wing, but their professional curiosity had been piqued by the unusual activity in supposedly sealed areas. We need to move Eleanor into a secure location until we can sort this out, Sarah said urgently, but David Hartman shook his head firmly. No more hiding. No more deception. My mother deserves to have her situation resolved with dignity and transparency. He stood up, placing a protective hand on Eleanor's shoulder. We've been preparing for this moment since the day we brought her here. Jenny Patterson had been quietly checking Eleanor's vital signs during the conversation, and now she looked up with professional concern. Eleanor's blood pressure is elevated, and she's showing signs of stress. All this commotion is overwhelming for someone with her condition. Rex seemed to sense Eleanor's distress and moved closer to her wheelchair, resting his large head gently on her lap. The gesture was so tender and natural that it was clear this had become their routine over the months of coexistence. Elena Rodriguez knelt beside Eleanor and spoke in soothing tones. Eleanor, you're going to be okay. Everyone here wants to help you, and soon you'll be in a proper facility where you can receive the care you need. Will Rex be able to visit me? Eleanor asked, her voice carrying the innocent concern of someone whose priorities had been simplified by her condition. He's been such a good friend. I don't want him to think I've abandoned him. The question broke something inside Jake Morrison. Here was a woman who had been failed by multiple systems, hidden in a prison for months, and her primary concern was for the well-being of a dog who had appointed himself her guardian. The sound of footsteps was getting closer, and Patricia Walsh's voice was becoming more strained as she ran out of ways to delay the inspection team. Sarah knew they had perhaps 2 minutes before the situation would spiral completely out of their control. "I need to know who helped you," Sarah said directly to David. "Not to punish them, but because they're about to face serious consequences, and they deserve a chance to explain their actions." David looked at Jenny, who nodded encouragingly. "The person who helped us was someone who had watched my mother deteriorate in that awful facility, someone who understood that sometimes the system fails people through indifference rather than malice." "David," Sarah said with growing urgency, "I need a name." Before David could answer, Bobby Williams stepped forward, his weathered face showing a mixture of resignation and pride. "It was me, Sarah. I helped them." The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. Bobby Williams had been her most trusted senior guard, a man whose judgment and integrity she had relied on for administrative decisions both large and small. He had been with Mountain View longer than anyone, had seen more administrations come and go, and had earned the respect of every person who worked there. "Bobby," Sarah breathed, trying to process the implications. "How could you risk everything? Your pension, your reputation, your freedom." Bobby's eyes were steady as he met her gaze. "Because I remembered why I became a corrections officer 30 years ago. It wasn't to punish people. It was to protect them, to ensure they were treated with basic human dignity. When David showed me the conditions his mother was living in, when he explained how the system had failed her, I couldn't stand by and do nothing." Marcus Thompson was staring at Bobby with a mixture of admiration and disbelief. "You've been managing all of this? The access codes, the supply deliveries, the security modifications?" Tom Bradley helped with the technical aspects, though he didn't know the full scope of what we were doing, Bobby admitted. "I told him we were conducting security assessments of abandoned areas, and Patricia Walsh processed some of the documentation, thinking it was part of a state audit preparation." Sarah felt the walls closing in around her. Half her senior staff had been involved, however peripherally, in this conspiracy of compassion. The state inspectors would not be understanding about unauthorized activities, regardless of the humanitarian motivations. Tom Bradley looked stunned. "You mean all those equipment requests and infrastructure surveys were for Eleanor?" "I needed to ensure she had proper heating, lighting, and medical support," Bobby explained. "Jenny couldn't care for her properly without basic amenities, and I couldn't let an elderly woman with dementia suffer in substandard conditions." Rex suddenly stood and moved to Bobby, pressing against his legs in a gesture of unmistakable loyalty and affection. The dog had clearly bonded with Bobby as much as with Eleanor, recognizing him as a protector and ally. Elena was watching the interactions with professional fascination. "Rex has been protecting all of you, hasn't he? His vigil at the cell was never about Eleanor specifically. It was about guarding the secret that kept her safe." "That dog is the smartest partner I've ever worked with," Bobby said, reaching down to scratch Rex's ears. He understood from the beginning that Eleanor needed protection, and he stationed himself where he could monitor anyone approaching her location. When people started getting curious about his behavior, he knew it was time for the truth to come out. The footsteps in the corridor were now just around the corner, and Patricia Walsh's voice had taken on a note of desperation as she tried to maintain her delaying tactics. Sarah knew that in about 30 seconds, their carefully contained situation would become a very public crisis. "What's going to happen to Eleanor?" Jenny asked, her professional concern overriding her personal fear about the consequences she might face. David squeezed his mother's hand. "The facility in Denver is ready for her. Dr. Margaret Stevens, the real Dr. Stevens, not the retired one whose name we borrowed, has reviewed Eleanor's case and confirmed that she can be admitted immediately if necessary." "Dr. Stevens?" Eleanor looked surprised. "Margaret Stevens is one of the most respected geriatric specialists in the state. How did you arrange for her involvement?" "She was my thesis advisor when I completed my master's degree in social work," David explained. "When I described Eleanor's situation, she agreed to expedite the placement process. She's been waiting for our call to confirm the transfer. Sarah made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. Then let's call her, now, before the inspectors discover this situation and turn it into a bureaucratic nightmare that could delay Eleanor's proper placement for months." Bobby looked at her with gratitude and amazement. "Sarah, if you officially authorize Eleanor's transfer, you'll be taking responsibility for everything that's happened. Your career could be over. Some things are more important than careers," Sarah said, echoing Bobby's earlier sentiment. She pulled out her cell phone and looked at David. "Give me Dr. Stevens' number." As David recited the contact information, Rex began pacing again, but this time his behavior was different. Instead of agitation or anxiety, his movement seemed almost celebratory, as if he sensed that his long vigil was finally coming to a successful conclusion. Eleanor had been listening to the conversation with the intermittent attention characteristic of her condition, but now she spoke with sudden clarity. Rex knew that if he kept watch long enough, people with good hearts would find us. He's been protecting more than just me. He's been protecting the hope that people would do the right thing when they understood the truth. The profound simplicity of her observation struck everyone in the room. Rex had indeed been protecting hope itself, maintaining faith that human compassion would ultimately prevail over bureaucratic indifference. Sarah finished dialing Dr. Stevens' number and waited for the connection. In the distance, she could hear the inspection team finally overwhelming Patricia Walsh's delaying tactics and beginning to move toward their location. So, next few minutes would determine whether Eleanor Hartman's story ended as a scandal that destroyed careers and reputations, or as a testament to the power of people to care for each other when systems fail. Rex positioned himself between Eleanor and the approaching sounds, but his posture was no longer defensive. Instead, he seemed to be presenting her to the world, finally ready to share the secret he had guarded so faithfully. The phone began to ring, and Sarah Collins prepared to make the most important call of her professional life. Dr. Margaret Stevens answered on the second ring, her voice carrying the authoritative warmth of someone accustomed to handling medical emergencies with both efficiency and compassion. "This is Dr. Stevens." "Doctor, this is Warden Sarah Collins at Mountain View Correctional Facility. I'm calling about Eleanor Hartman's emergency placement. We need to expedite her transfer immediately." The brief pause on the other end suggested Dr. Stevens was processing the unexpected call from a prison warden. "Warden Collins, David Hartman has kept me informed about his mother's temporary situation. I have a bed ready and a care team standing by. Can you have Eleanor here within 2 hours?" "Yes," Sarah said without hesitation, even as she heard the inspection team's voices getting closer. "I'm authorizing an emergency medical transport immediately." Rex had moved to the window and was looking out at the prison yard, his tail wagging. For the first time since anyone could remember, it was as if he understood that his long vigil was about to end successfully, that the person he had been protecting was finally going home. Eleanor reached up and touched her son's face with the gentle gesture of a mother who, despite her confusion about many things, never forgot her love for her child. "David, you've worked so hard to take care of me. I'm proud of the man you've become, even when you made mistakes." The simple statement carried years of forgiveness, understanding, and unconditional love. David's eyes filled with tears as he knelt beside his mother's wheelchair. "I promise you, Mom, you're going to be safe and happy. Dr. Stevens has a beautiful facility with gardens and music therapy, and they specialize in caring for people with memory challenges." Jenny Patterson had been preparing Eleanor's medications and personal items for transport. "I've documented everything about Eleanor's care over the past 6 months. Her condition has actually stabilized and improved with consistent medication and proper nutrition. Dr. Stevens will have a complete medical history to ensure continuity of care." The inspection team's footsteps were now clearly audible in the corridor outside, accompanied by Patricia Walsh's voice explaining that there had been some unusual activity in the abandoned wing that required investigation. Sarah knew they had perhaps 60 seconds before the situation would explode into a full bureaucratic crisis. Bobby Williams stepped forward and placed his hand on Sarah's shoulder. "Sarah, I want you to know that whatever consequences come from this, I'd do it again. Eleanor Hartman deserved better than what she was getting, and sometimes doing what's right is more important than following what's legal." Bobby, Sarah said quietly, "I'm not going to let you take the fall for this alone. You did what any decent human being should do when faced with suffering they have the power to alleviate." Marcus Thompson looked at his senior colleagues with newfound respect. "What should I tell the inspectors when they ask about my involvement?" "Tell them the truth," Sarah replied. "Tell them you witnessed a group of people who chose compassion over convenience, who refused to let an elderly woman slip through the cracks of an imperfect system." Tom Bradley was shaking his head in amazement. "In 35 years of maintenance work, I've never been prouder to be part of a team. Even though I didn't understand the full situation, I'm glad my work helped keep Eleanor safe and comfortable." Elena Rodriguez had been observing the group dynamics throughout the entire discovery, and now she spoke with the insight of someone trained to understand human behavior. "What you've all accomplished here is remarkable. You created a support system for someone who had been forgotten by every official channel designed to protect her. That's not criminal conspiracy, that's community." Rex moved from person to person, as if saying goodbye to each member of the team that had kept Eleanor safe. When he reached Eleanor, he rested his massive head in her lap one final time, and she stroked his fur with gentle, grateful hands. "Thank you, Rex," she whispered. "You watched over me when I was confused and scared. I'll never forget you." The German shepherd's tail wagged slowly, and he looked up at Eleanor with eyes that seemed to hold understanding far beyond what should be possible for an animal. He had completed his mission. The person he had sworn to protect was finally going home. The footsteps stopped outside the doorway, and Chief Inspector Robert Hayes appeared with Patricia Walsh and 2 other state officials. His expression was one of professional skepticism mixed with genuine curiosity about what he was about to encounter. "Warden Collins," Inspector Hayes said formally, "we understand there's been some irregular activity in this sealed area. Can you explain the situation?" Sarah Collins stood straighter, drawing on every ounce of leadership authority she had developed over her career. "Inspector Hayes, you are witnessing the conclusion of an emergency humanitarian intervention. Mrs. Eleanor Hartman, a 73-year-old woman with dementia, was facing life-threatening neglect in her previous care facility. My staff and I provided temporary emergency shelter while arranging for her transfer to appropriate specialized care." The inspector's eyebrows rose. You housed a civilian in a maximum security prison without proper authorization. I authorized emergency compassionate care for a vulnerable individual while following proper medical protocols and ensuring her safety and dignity, Sarah replied steadily. Mrs. Hartman is being transferred today to Mountain Vista Memory Care in Denver, under the supervision of Dr. Margaret Stevens. Inspector Hayes looked around the room, taking in Eleanor's obvious frailty, Jenny's medical supplies, Rex's protective posture, and the genuine concern on every face present. His expression gradually shifted from skepticism to something approaching admiration. This is highly irregular, Warden Collins. I'll need complete documentation and a full report on how this situation developed. You'll have everything you need, Sarah assured him. But right now, my priority is ensuring Mrs. Hartman reaches her new home safely. David stepped forward and addressed Inspector Hayes directly. Sir, I take full responsibility for bringing my mother here. These people saved her life when every official system had failed her. If anyone should face consequences, it should be me. And me, Bobby Williams added. I facilitated everything. And me, Jenny Patterson said. I provided unauthorized medical care. Elena Rodriguez smiled at the display of solidarity. Inspector Hayes, what you're witnessing is people taking responsibility not for wrongdoing, but for doing what was necessary to protect someone who couldn't protect herself. Inspector Hayes was quiet for a long moment, processing the unusual situation. Finally, he spoke with the careful tone of someone who recognized that some situations transcend normal bureaucratic procedures. Warden Collins, I want a complete report within 48 hours. But for now, let's focus on getting Mrs. Hartman to her new home. I'll arrange for a state medical transport vehicle to ensure she arrives safely. Rex barked once, a sound of approval and finality. His vigil was complete. 2 hours later, Eleanor Hartman was settled into a comfortable room at Mountain Vista Memory Care, surrounded by afternoon sunlight and the gentle sounds of a garden fountain. Dr. Stevens confirmed that her condition was stable and that the quality of care she had received during her unconventional stay had actually improved her overall health. David held his mother's hand as she dozed peacefully in her new bed. Jenny had agreed to visit regularly to help with the transition, and Dr. Stevens had offered her a position on the facility's nursing staff. Back at Mountain View, Rex had returned to his regular duties, but every afternoon he would pause by the empty cell and look toward the window, as if checking on a friend who was no longer there but would never be forgotten. Bobby Williams faced a formal reprimand, but kept his pension and the respect of everyone who worked with him. Sarah Collins received both criticism and praise from state officials, but her handling of the situation ultimately strengthened her position as a warden who put human dignity above bureaucratic convenience. Inspector Hayes's final report noted that while proper procedures had been violated, the humanitarian outcome demonstrated the kind of creative problem-solving that the correctional system needed more of, not less. 6 months later, Eleanor was thriving in her new environment, participating in music therapy and tending a small garden with flowers that Rex would have approved of. David had completed his social work degree and was advocating for policy changes to prevent other families from falling through systemic cracks. And in the abandoned wing of Mountain View Correctional Facility, maintenance workers found a small plaque that someone had installed near cell 47D. It read, "In honor of Rex, who taught us that the most important duty is caring for those who cannot care for themselves." The story of Eleanor Hartman, her son David, the compassionate staff of Mountain View, and one faithful German shepherd became a testament to the power of people to see beyond rules and regulations to the human needs that matter most. Sometimes the greatest courage isn't found in following orders. It's found in the quiet decision to do what's right, even when no one is watching. Rex's vigil had ended, but the lesson he taught would guard the hearts of everyone who witnessed it for the rest of their lives. Dear listeners, we hope Eleanor and Rex's story has touched your hearts as deeply as it has ours. Sometimes the most powerful bonds are formed in the most unexpected circumstances, and the greatest acts of courage come from choosing compassion over convenience. If this tale of loyalty, family, and the determination to do what's right has moved you, we invite you to join our community by subscribing to our channel and giving this video a thumbs up. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever witnessed someone go above and beyond to help another person in need? Your stories inspire us to keep bringing you these powerful narratives about the complexity and beauty of human relationships. Don't forget to click the bell icon to be notified when we share new stories that explore the extraordinary moments hidden within ordinary lives. We'll be waiting for you in the comments.